Good afternoon. Thank you for joining this webinar about the impact of trauma exposure on corrections professionals. Also referred to as secondary or vicarious trauma, this has emerged as an important topic for corrections organizations and their staff. Research suggests that constant exposure to disturbing aspects of human behavior and the pain and suffering of others can come with a price for professionals. This webinar will define and discuss compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout as it relates to community corrections. This webinar will also review self-care strategies that have been successful in reducing the impact of trauma exposure and utilize interactive technology that allows participants to measure their own stress and resilience during the presentation. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and to APPA and Kirsten Lewis for partnering with us on this presentation. My name is Heather Tubman-Carbone. I oversee technical assistance for the corrections portfolio at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I will be your moderator today, and I'm excited to introduce our presenter and partner. Kirsten Lewis is the co-owner and lead trainer at KSL Research, Training, and Consultation. She's also a probation officer with the Maricopa County Adult Probation Department and an adjunct psychology instructor at Glendale Community College, an approved instructor by the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. Kirsten's adult probation experience includes supervising standard field, domestic violence, sex offender, and high-risk offender cases. In addition, Kirsten has been a pre-sentence investigation officer, acting supervisor, and currently holds a position as a full-time trainer in staff development. With a background in research and over 24 years of experience in community corrections, Kirsten spearheaded a groundbreaking research study examining secondary traumatic stress in probation officers as a result of working with criminal offenders. Her research was recently published in the American Journal of Criminal Justice, featured in Perspectives, the National Journal of the American Probation and Parole Association, and received the 2013 Sam Houston State University Award for outstanding contributions to scholarship in community corrections. In addition, Kirsten has created a national award-winning employee stress management program at MCAPD that better prepares employees for the emotional challenges of probation work, enhances protective coping strategies, minimizes the cumulative stress associated with longevity, and promotes a work culture that safeguards the welfare of officers. Kirsten conducts a variety of trainings on the topic of traumatic stress and employee wellness with criminal justice agencies around the country and has presented her work at conferences throughout the United States and abroad. She received her master's in education in 2003 with an emphasis in counseling and human relations from Northern Arizona University. Also with us today is Nathan Lowe, a research associate with the American Probation and Parole Association, an affiliate of the Council of State Governments. He'll tell you more about his work in a moment. Before getting started, I'd like to briefly talk through a couple of housekeeping items about how the webinar is going to work. First, if you encounter technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues you may not be able to resolve immediately. For this reason, we are recording the content portion of this webinar and will post it on our website at csgjusticecenter.org/NRRC. We should have the webinar posted online early next week. Once it has been posted, we will email all registrants with the link. Also, throughout the webinar, you may enter questions for a presenter or either partner organization by clicking on the Q&A icon in the top right-hand corner of your screen. A dialog box will appear and you may enter questions there. We will answer all questions, or as many as we can get to, at the end of the webinar. A quick introduction to the Council of State Governments agencies partnering to bring you this event. The Justice Center is a national nonprofit association that serves policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels and all branches of government. Staff provide practical, nonpartisan advice and evidence-based, consensus-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. Within the Justice Center, the National Reentry Resource Center is funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and we provide support to Second Chance Act grantees and the broader field. We are constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events, and other news about reentry. To sign up for the newsletter, please visit the link on your screen after today's webinar. Now, I'll turn the floor over to Nathan to talk about the American Probation and Parole Association.
Thank you, Heather. Appreciate that. Talk a little bit about, for those, this is a great number of attendees today. And we're grateful to be partnering with the CSG Justice Center and have a dynamic and wonderful speaker like Kirsten available to talk with us. For those of you who are unfamiliar with APPA, we are as Heather said, an affiliate organization of the CSG. We are the leading national organization for those people who are working in the community corrections field. We're certainly a membership-driven organization comprised of an executive board, but we also have folks who work in a number of different areas on grants and grant projects to be able to provide trainings like this for you today. Personally, in my role, I've been with APP over 6 years, and during that entire time have had a strong partnership in working with the Justice Center staff on the National Reentry Resource Center and some other projects, but particularly the NRRC, to be able to host and conduct webinars like this on a variety of different training topics. And so we're very, very pleased to be able to present Kirsten Lewis at this time to get into the presentation. Simply my role, obviously Kirsten is going to be providing the majority of the content, delivery of the content, but I am going to interject at times to provide some interaction with some of the questions and polls that she has for you. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Kirsten.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am sitting in Phoenix, Arizona in 85-degree temperatures. I don't know where the rest of you are. I'm looking at the numbers, which appear to be, at this point, over 900 people listening in on this conference. I have to say the number has been really surprising, and at the same time, I guess not. I always start the presentations talking about this topic of trauma exposure by just simply sharing a little bit about how I came to be somebody even remotely qualified to run around talking about the topic. It started after 10 years in the probation department as a full-time officer, and just having, over the years, watching my world change, watching how I looked at people starting to change, becoming a parent, and looking at my children out in the world and my concerns for them, and really wondering why was this happening? And it wasn't a topic that I heard talked about very often. I mean, we tend to, I think as officers down in the trenches, we talk about cases, we talk about some of the crazy stuff we see, but rarely are we talking about at times that it's hard to sleep at night with the images that we have, that it's hard to trust people you don't know. It's hard to let our kids out of our sight. Those were not the things that I was hearing. And so started this research project and just trying to really ask the question, am I alone? Am I alone in the way that my world is changing? And to see the numbers of people signing up for a conference like this, I think in and of itself answers that question that, no, I'm not alone. So how we're going to go about talking for the next hour and 15 minutes about this topic, I have to tell you, it's a little weird on my end giving the webinars. As daunting as it is to think that I'm talking to over 900 people right now, I need you guys. I need your faces. I need your feedback. I need to see your eyes. It's really hard to sit in an office by myself talking to a wall and do this presentation. So I'm going to be attempting to have you guys interact throughout the presentation, and in fact, we'll start with my first question. So if you are one of those people who multitask while you do webinars, in other words, you're listening and at the same time doing all your other work, I need you to stop for just a second and go back to your computer, because we're going to have polling that should pop up on the right-hand side of your screen, and I need you to answer. I'd like to be able to get your input on this question, which is, do you believe that working in the criminal justice system has changed the way that you view the world? And we've got, I think we were going to give you guys like a minute and a half to answer with over 900 people, some of you scrambling to get back to your keypads. Just go ahead and click in your answer. The difficult thing with trying to do the polling is now I'm going to have about 2 minutes of airtime to cover while I give you guys the opportunity to answer these questions. While I'm just trying to, go ahead.
Certainly, yeah, no, I think this is a great question. You know, I was reading and thinking back over this. This is quite interesting one to kind of start with. Certainly you think that people working in the justice system, that experience, that perspective, it makes it somewhat unique in how you see human behavior. So I wonder if you could kind of play both sides and get, you know, what you would see as, yes, it has changed you, and then people who would answer no, you know, what kind of their perspective look like, you think?
Yeah, well, typically when we're able to verbally communicate, the answers that people give in terms of why their worlds are changing or how, they're talking about being super hypervigilant, just that chronically suspicious of other people, losing trust, losing empathy, being a bit desensitized, certainly the overprotective parenting, those types of things, being cynical, are usually the first things that pop up. And what's interesting is, despite the various audiences that I've presented it to, it's almost universal, the way people answer. Now, I'm going to show you, once we get the data collected with this group, I'll show you what I've collected from several thousand POs and correctional officers nationwide. Typically, it is not a large percentage of people that say no. Their worlds have not changed. And what's been interesting about the group that says no is that typically that group, many of them say, the only reason I'm saying my world has not changed is because I grew up with parents who were police officers or, you know, correctional officers, whatever, and I never trusted people to begin with. So, nope, it hasn't changed all that much. But by and large, the vast majority, we're seeing, in fact, it looks like our polling, Jan, is that our polling coming up now? I can't actually see any percentages unless I'm not reading this correctly.
Yeah, it shows at about, I think the way I'm reading it, about 77% said
okay.
yes.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing too.
Okay, yeah, somehow it's not coming up terribly well on my screen. Let me show you, so about 77% are saying yes. Here is nationally what I'm collecting with almost 3,000 correctional officers is a large percentage of people saying yes, indeed, that their worlds are changing. Now, when I'm asking why, one of the first things that typically comes up is cynicism, that people are finding themselves much more cynical. And if any of you have had an opportunity to listen to Kevin Gilmartin or read his book that he wrote, it's called The Emotional Survival of Law Enforcement. Kevin Gilmartin is a fantastic author. He was a sheriff's deputy as well as a psychologist for a police department for many years. He's now retired, and he travels talking about this topic. But he was one of the first people looking at the emotional survival of law enforcement. And he did a presentation that I had an opportunity to listen to a few years ago, and I loved how he started it. He was also asking the very same questions. Are your worlds changing? And in this eclectic audience of police and fire and community corrections and correctional facilities, I mean, all of the people pretty much involved in public safety were there. And he asked the question, is your world changing? Yes, indeed. Most people said yes. Cynicism consistently comes up. And he pointed out that the actual definition of cynicism is a pervasive distrust of human nature and motives. That's the Webster dictionary definition. Well, here's what's also interesting. A pervasive distrust of human nature and motives is also what we call officer safe. It's also how we train people in order to keep people safe, in order to allow people to approach situations from a tactical perspective that should something go south, that they are able to respond quickly and from a advantage point to increase the likelihood that they're going to go home at night. And so the very thing that allows people to stay safe at work, the professional mindset necessary for safety, over time can start to become the lens through which you see the whole world, this lens of distrust. And he made this beautiful point, and I'll reiterate it. As he was talking to us, this eclectic audience in public safety, he said, you know, to describe this phenomena, he said, I could put you in a room of 100 people. He said, and I could strategically place 3 bad guys somewhere in that room. And you guys are so good at what you do, you'll find them. He said, you know, and quite frankly, he said, I'm not terribly surprised by that because you're well-trained. He said, you know, we know risk factors, you're dialed into human behavior. He said, so your ability to find the 3 bad guys in the herd is really not the issue. He said the real cost of this job, of this work, is that over time, you're losing the ability to see the herd. That there's also 97 people in that room of whom you guys don't see anymore because you are so busy looking for those, you know, the bad guys. And so you'll even leave that function saying to yourself, yep, see, I mean, world full of nothing but bad guys. And so the lens with which we're seeing the world can become very distorted. And part of it, I think, is also the skewed nature of what we do, in that we see a very skewed view of the world. When you work in community corrections, when you work in institutions, when you work in law enforcement, you know, we see a high percentage of criminals all day long. That's our business. And the reality is that doesn't come close to reflecting the demographics of our society. And so it's, I think, very natural for our worlds to become skewed because simply that is what we are seeing. That's our life experience. But the reality is it's not an accurate perception of the demographics of the communities that we live in. So now let's talk about traumatic stress in terms of being able to just define it. Trauma is often used as a very broad way to describe extremely stressful situations. There is a lot of stress, without a doubt, doing the various types of work that we do. But we're going to differentiate traumatic stress from just organizational stress in general in terms of, you know, the deadlines and the shift work and caseload size and those types of things, because when traumatic stress happens, usually there's these 4 components that typically with a traumatic event, we don't see it coming. It's very sudden, it's very unexpected, it wasn't in the day planner. The event itself is typically distressing, that there's an element of danger or risk to somebody. It can overwhelm our coping capacity. But probably most importantly in terms of how it just differentiates from regular stress is it has this potential to change how we see the world. I mean, you can take an accountant during tax season and you're going to have a really stressed out employee. But typically, even in the midst of their stress, the world itself doesn't change. Traumatic stress, I mean, 9/11, for example, was certainly a traumatic, you know, event for many people. And that had a way of changing how we forever saw the world. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but certainly, you know, looking up in the sky and seeing airplanes after 9/11, they did not look the same anymore. So our worlds start to change with traumatic stress. Now, what's important in defining traumatic stress is that, you know, trauma is in the eye of the beholder. And so what may be traumatic to me or to one person may not be traumatic to somebody else. Personally, I've never had much difficulty working DUI cases, for example. But I did have a colleague a number of years ago whose brother was killed by a drunk driver. And so for him, DUI cases were very different than how they you know, affected me. So it's important to recognize trauma is different for people. Okay. Now we're going to define the different types of trauma. When we're talking about primary traumatic stress, primary is referring to direct, that you're there in person, directly experiencing the trauma or directly witnessing it in real time. And so some of the things, as I've talked to the staff that work inside the jails and the prisons, the things that, you know, they're there in person, those types of traumatic stress that they've reported were things like being assaulted, being threatened, certainly the riots or the hostage situations, many times of their peers, right? Needing to intervene during violent situations, cutting somebody down after a suicide, some of the medical emergencies, the blood, the gore, the smells, at times dealing with unethical behavior of our peers, when at the same time you need these peers to back you up, and being in this conundrum of, you know, not approving of unethical behavior, needing to do something about it, and at the same time the dilemma that puts people in. It's awful stuff. And then in addition, you know, certainly any of the agencies that oversee executions have the potential for traumatic stress. In the world of community corrections, things that we found in our research that agents or officers talked about were things, again, being assaulted, being threatened. Out in the field, there's the potential of being stalked, observing violence or death or suicide, being out in the field, the animals, especially in some of the rural areas, those pit bulls, or the near misses. And so as we're talking about this, I'm hoping that you guys are thinking, because the next polling question is how many? If you were to think about your career, on the right-hand side of your screen, you should have another polling question pop up in terms of how many primary traumatic events have you experienced. And by definition, let's be clear that we'll define it as it has to actually have caused you traumatic stress. I mean, if being assaulted is just another way to practice your defensive tactic skills and that's good fun, don't count those. Count the ones that actually really caused some level of traumatic stress for you. Part of the difficulty in even studying this topic is there's not very clear data in terms of how to know how often this type of stuff happens. So being able to ask questions from audience members has been really important to try to get an idea of how frequently these types of events occur. All right.
Yeah, Kirsten, I wonder how these responses to this particular question varies by years of experience and maybe even specific job duties. I mean, you mentioned a lot of things that could happen in the field, or just in the given nature of someone's job that it kind of involves more emergency type situations. But has any of your research kind of teased out some of those nuances?
Well, certainly, you know, longevity. I mean, the longer you're in the job, the greater likelihood there is that you've been exposed to primary trauma. So, yeah, absolutely. I have found that within the institutions, there tends to be more primary trauma. And even when I've done some of the work with some of the agencies that probation and parole is part of DOC, which is not the same in all states, many of those community correctional populations of the officers have more primary trauma, but what they tell me when I ask, because it's so much higher than what I typically collect, they'll say most of my primary trauma came from being inside the jails or the prisons. Another surprising, actually, demographic or population was the courtroom. I was really surprised when I started working with the judges and the attorneys and the court staff how many primary traumatic events happen in the courtroom. Their data was really high, even higher than what I was seeing with law enforcement. So that was pretty interesting. Okay, Jan or Nate, Nathan, I'm going to have you help me. I can't see very well in terms of what percentage do we have in 4 more.
Sure. It looks like the majority, 21%, but of course, about almost a third of the attendees weren't able to answer. So I suspect that number probably to be higher. But of those who answered, it was certainly 4 more was the most, 21%.
Okay. Okay, and again, not terribly far off from almost 2,500 employees I've collected data from, where about 30%, 29% are reporting 4 or more. It would be interesting if we had been able to collect the demographics of who's responding to see differences, which is always, I think, useful information. But for our purposes, it appears to be very, very similar to what I've collected so far. Now, here's my next question, which is connected to this, so don't go away from your polling. My next question is, did you feel supported by your agency? So for those of you who did have either one or more traumatic events, primary traumatic events, what was your opinion in terms of your level of support? Did you feel like you were being supported? And if you had multiple, I know this is a hard question, just put them all together. In general, how would you describe the support that you felt like you received from your agency?
Yeah, and I wonder if you could give some context while we're waiting for the answer. And I don't want to give anything away, but
right.
Could you just kind of maybe provide some context to ways that agencies could provide support? I'm sure you're talking about a wide range of different things.
Yeah, and again, it's a very subjective question as well in terms of what made people feel supported. I mean, sometimes it is the direct response of their supervisor, that when they went to their supervisor and said, you know, here's the deal, you know, I had a guy threaten to kill me, blah, blah, blah. It depends how that is met, you know, by the agency. If it's met with some level of support in terms of, I'm so sorry to hear that, how are you doing, being kind of some of the first questions, that typically goes over a little bit better when it's met with answers like, well, you know, we all get threatened, that's part of the job, or, you know, they never really mean it because they're just, you know, blowing off steam. That doesn't always feel so good to the person who has been through an event. So there's various ways, whether or not the agencies take it seriously, whether or not the agencies turn around and blame the employee for why did you put yourself in this situation? Why did, you know, you make this person mad? You know, not only are those not supportive ways, those can actually be ways that can be incredibly traumatizing in and of itself. So I have heard the full gamut, even if it is offering peer support. There's a lot, we're going to talk about that toward the end of the presentation in terms of having peer support teams available and just simply being able to offer that. Okay, I'm seeing some data pop up on the screen. What's the not at all answer, which the bar looks the longest on that one?
It's at about 8%, and of course, unfortunately, about 43% of the folks didn't answer. So 67 recipient attendees out of the 874.
Okay, so how much are in the not at all category?
About 8%.
80 or 8?
8%.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, I wish I could see the data a little bit better. Here is typically what I'm finding. So does it look, Jan, more like more people are feeling supported or more people reporting not feeling supported?
It looks like majority of people were in the somewhat, not very much, to not at all areas of those who respond. Okay.
So does it look similar to the graph I'm putting up right now?
It sure does, yes.
Yeah, yeah, and so this is interesting, and I think really good feedback for our profession to have, and as well as the fact that universally this is what I'm finding. I mean, this is not unique to any specific department, and obviously we've got a group of people from all over the country right now, even outside of the country, giving this feedback. And this, I think, is really something to pay attention to. Because our staff, I think, are our greatest resource. And when they are willing to put themselves in harm's way to do the jobs that they do, and as a result of their work end up exposed to primary trauma, I do think that we have an ethical and moral obligation to support them. And what this data consistently is showing is that as a profession, we are missing this opportunity. And so I think this gives us some really important feedback. And we're going to come back to this point later in the presentation. But let me show you a bit about the symptoms of trauma. So when people have been through traumatic events, some of the most common physical symptoms that you'll see are the headaches. And in fact, headaches are most common after a physical traumatic event or a primary traumatic event, largely from dehydration. That the body, when it goes into a fight or flight response, simply dehydrates. It becomes so exhausted from the neurobiological aspect of a fight or flight response that it dehydrates. So one of the best things that you can do following a traumatic event is get some fluids going. So otherwise, we've got the muscle tension, the increased heart rate, some of the cognitive things, meaning the ways that we think. There's a period of time where a lot of people experience some disbelief that did not just happen, right? Or just numb. They just don't feel anything. There's a bit of shock. That's really common. Or having, especially if it was gory, having some intrusive imagery where you're just kind of seeing those images over and over again for a few days. We may ruminate about it, where the scene plays over in our heads, and you just can't get your brain to stop thinking. What is kind of interesting is that some of the research shows that after traumatic events, the learning center and the memory centers of your brain light up with activity. And that this is actually part of stress resilience, that we start ruminating about it because this is the brain's way of trying to learn what the heck just happened, figure out what it can from it, so that should this ever happen again, we can use this. We can be able to draw experience. And so although this may not be pleasant in terms of ruminating and not being able to turn your head off, this is your brain doing its job. So it's actually kind of interesting and kind of cool when you look at it just from stress resilience. Okay, some of the emotional symptoms people see, anger, anxiety, depression. Behaviorally, you may see changes in eating, some substance use, trying to just kind of dull those responses. There may be some hyper-startle, some withdrawal. And although I'm flying through this, again, this is all going to be made to you guys, made available to you later, so you can also go back if I'm flying through these pretty quickly. Also spiritually. Some of the things people talk about in terms of just trying to spiritually make sense of the things that they see. So in order to put this together, I'm going to give you 3 examples. And I just want you to listen in these stories for symptoms that tip you off of trauma. Okay? So this was actually given by McCann and Perlman back in the 1990s when they were writing an article talking about trauma. And the first example is about a guy named Tom. Okay? He's a married man. He's in his late 20s. He's a new dad. He loves being a father. And yet, ever since he has been a father, he has had these very disturbing, intrusive images involving his kids getting hurt or killed. He's becoming a bit obsessed about their safety, right? He doesn't want them out of their sight. He's hypervigilant when there's strange noises in the night. He's up checking the doors, checking the windows. If his wife is late coming home with the kids after work, I mean, he's got them dead in a ditch somewhere. I mean, car accident, immediately they're dead. I mean, that's just where he goes. He often has nightmares about losing his kids. He lays awake at night for hours at times, unable to shake this just pervasive sense of anxiety, okay? So that's Tom. Second story is about a woman named Joan. She's a single mom. She's got a daughter who's in some type of school play, okay? So she goes to this assembly. She's sitting in the auditorium waiting for the show to start, and she's people watching. And in the door walks this old man holding hands with this little kid, probably a grandfather with his grandchild. So she watches them walk in, and he sits down, and he puts this kid on his lap, and he starts kind of tickling and playing with this little girl. And in her mind's eye, she starts to see him sexually molest the child, right? I mean, just very disturbing images. So she tries to busy herself and think about other things and whatnot. But when she gets home and she thinks about this situation, she realizes she does this all the time. She sees an old man with a little kid, and she sees a sex offender. Last story is about a woman named Anne. She's single in her 30s, and she, every night without fail, wakes up in a cold sweat after experiencing a vivid, recurring night terror about being brutally attacked at knife point. She turns on all the lights every night. She lays awake. She can't go back to sleep. She doesn't want to go back to sleep. And it's so bad that during the day, if she so much as even sees the blade of a knife, she can feel herself breaking out in a sweat, right? So these three people, when you think about the symptoms that I've just described, these stories, if I actually could talk to you, most of you would say, or hopefully be able to point out, that the things that we were hearing was nightmares, fearful thoughts, right? Those intrusive images, chronically suspicious of other people, the anxiety, the pervasive, right, worry, those types of things, all of which are some of the trauma symptoms we just went over. But here's the interesting thing about these three people. Nothing has happened to them. None of them have had a primary traumatic event occur in their lives. What all three of them have in common is that they all work in jobs where they spend a significant part of their workday listening to or reading about somebody else's trauma. And that, by definition, is secondary trauma. So secondary trauma, which is also known as compassion fatigue, is when professionals start to experience the same trauma symptoms that we just went over with primary trauma, but not because they themselves have been through the events, but because they are inundated with listening to or reading about other people going through those events. And neurologically, the body starts responding in very similar ways. So the hypervigilance, the intrusive thoughts starting to detach and numb out, problem sleeping, those types of things can all start to develop through this secondary traumatic stress. So in this case, secondary is referring to indirect, okay? So primary is when you're directly there during the event, right? So it's either happening to you or happening right in front of you. Secondary is when you're not there in real time or it's not happening to you. It didn't occur to you. It was somebody else, okay? And so the impact is through another person. Judith Herman, who has done a lot of work with trauma survivors, she says in particular that those who work with offenders are often called upon to bear witness to the crimes. And I found that to really resonate. There's a lot of ways when you work with justice-involved people that we are exposed in our various capacities, whether or not in the prisons, a lot of that in the jail is direct observation of some, at times, really strange and disturbing behavior. Reading graphic police reports, reading or writing pre-sentence investigations, the criminal histories. As we're doing more evidence-based practices and assessments, we are finding more and more information. We are digging deeper, and we are learning more about the histories, especially the trauma histories of the people that we're dealing with. The victim contacts, going out into the community, the collaterals, the living environments. And in fact, one of the more disturbing cases I had one time or that just kind of stuck with me, I was out talking to one of my guys on intensive probation. We had been standing in his living room for maybe 10 minutes having just a normal conversation when in the front door walks his little 3-year-old by herself and nothing but a diaper, which she was a bit old to be wearing, right? And I'm looking at her and looking at him. I'm like, well, where did she come from? And he's like, oh, she was just down at the park. By herself? Well, yeah, he says, you know, we all kind of look out for each other around here. You live in a gang, drug, sex offender-infested apartment complex, and you all look out for each other. This kid is 3 years old. And in addition was wearing this diaper, which she's too old to be wearing, that was sagging down to at least her knees. You know, and although she was fine and, you know, everything was okay, my heart just broke, you know, as I'm looking at this kid. So this exposure that we have to trauma comes in a variety of different ways. My next question, so all of my multitaskers, I need you to swing back to your computers. The next polling question that's going to pop up is to find out from you guys in the course of your day, how often would you say you are exposed to traumatic material? And again, that can come in lots of different shapes and sizes. I will tell you another story as we're waiting for 900 people to respond. when I was working another caseload, my partner and I had a case where they were young. I mean, these girls were like in their 20s. They were adults, but they had, I think, committed like an armed robbery with their boyfriends. The boyfriends were really the ones behind it. The girls kind of got caught up in it. So the boys went off to prison. The girls ended up, I think, getting probation. And so one of the sisters that was on our caseload, she was, again, maybe 19 or 20, and had an 18-month-old child. And when she was arrested and put in jail, and then when she got probation, I think the judge gave her 3 months of jail up front. So her little 18-month-old child went to go stay with her sister while she was in custody. Well, while she was in custody, the sister's boyfriend murdered her baby. And so when this probationer got out of jail and, you know, would come to see us in the office, her grief, her own trauma was absolutely palpable. I mean, she wouldn't talk about it. She had a little picture of this baby in her folder. But to just every day that I saw this woman be exposed to her level of grief. And then in addition, I had an 18-month-old baby at the time myself. And so to go around and, you know, turn around and go home and look at my own kid, wondering how in the world do people manage dealing with the loss of the murder of a child, especially because you were in custody. I mean, it was just a mess. So, okay, it looks like your data is up, and although I can't, Jan, what does the top two look like, the almost always and frequently? What is the percentages there?
I'll speak up for Jan. I'm sure he may be preoccupied. It looks like about 27% of those who responded said frequently.
Okay.
15% said always.
Okay.
So yeah, it's quite reflective of the numbers you just showed.
Okay. Yeah, and here's the national sample that I have where we've got, what is that, 51% between frequently and almost always. That's a lot of trauma exposure. It just simply is. So what do we do with that? Okay. Let me see. The secondary traumatic events, these were events that had occurred on our watch. So things that, and again, it's not, we weren't there when it occurred. It was somebody else's experience, but it was events that created secondary trauma in the employees. The things that we found in our research, people reporting, were things like when our offenders die, when they commit suicide, when they go out and kill somebody, when they hurt another child. The sexual recidivism, that's actually for me what started this whole project, was having one of my sex offenders on my watch go out and hurt 2 children and living with that. And although in your head you can know, you know, we do our best, we give the resources, but in the end they have free will. I get that in my head, but down in my heart, those are tough ones to live with. Sometimes when our people are murdered, certainly anytime another colleague is hurt or injured or killed, has a way of rocking the entire institution of staff. And it's only considered secondary if you're not there. So if you're coming in and you find out the previous shift, you know, all hell broke loose and the hostage situation and whatnot and your colleagues, and so it would be secondary to the people finding out about it after the fact. And again, they weren't there when it occurred. That's why it's called secondary. It's indirect. So my next question to you guys is how often, when you think about secondary traumatic events, the things that really, by definition, caused some level of secondary trauma to you guys, how many have you experienced in your career? So again, my multitaskers, scoot on back to your mouses. How many of the cases with the suicides or going out and killing somebody or, you know, having to deliver horrible inside the institutions, horrible information to an inmate that their kid has been, you know, killed or died of a drug overdose, things that in the end were not easy to bear witness to. And again, it's this indirect exposure.
Yeah, I suspect this one also is going to vary by years of experience. I mean, getting some of the demographics and their job duties as well, and you know, and also certainly some interesting trends there. And we're kind of reflecting back to the slides or the poll you had a few moments ago about just the level of support or how supportive do they feel. I think we're, you know, I'm not getting ahead of ourselves here, but it seems like that's kind of the trend that's going to be revealing itself, right?
Yep, exactly. And you're absolutely right, Nathan, that, you know, it depends on the fields. I mean, in the institutions, what I see is more primary than secondary trauma. In community corrections and in the community, like rehabs and mental health professions, we see a lot more secondary than primary. So this does seem to differ based on how we come at the work and what our exposure is. When I was out in Colorado shortly after the director, Tom Clements, had been murdered at his front door, the director of DOC, there was an administrator, actually, who had shared in a training. He was talk about secondary trauma for him, that for those of you who aren't familiar, apparently the shooter was a former inmate, I understand, and had dressed up in a pizza delivery outfit and gone to the front door of the director's home, and then as soon as the director opened it, shot and killed him. And so this other administrator was telling me a few weeks later, after this, you know, event had occurred, he was home on a Saturday, you know, minding his own business. He hears the doorbell, and before he knows it, his wife has already answered the door and is talking to the person in a uniform standing at the front door. It was like, I don't know, some guy selling, you know, cable TV or whatever. But he said his level of reaction, I mean, he ran over, he pretty much threw his wife out of the, you know, way. He's yelling at the Cox cable guy to get out of his yard and never come back and blah, blah, blah. And he said his wife, you know, looked at him after he shut the door and was like, you know, we are not living like this. But he was saying, I mean, that is absolutely a secondary trauma type of response where, although, again, he wasn't there when the director himself was murdered, that level of trauma and knowing what had happened to somebody else in our line of work certainly has a way of influencing us and our worlds. So, okay, so looking at the percentages, now it looks very different. Okay, so 65%, is that what we're seeing in the 4 or more category?
Yes.
Okay, and so that's actually quite a bit higher than even what I have found, which was the 48%. So again, quite a bit of secondary. In fact, out of this group, we'd say more secondary than primary trauma. So here's my next question that was tailed in this, which is, did you feel supported? So for those of you who did have those experiences, Jan, are you going to switch the polling question? Did you feel supported? And again, it's a tough question in terms of if you've had many of them, put them all together. And in general, how would you say you felt in terms of support from your agency after your events or event?
So here you're trying to differentiate between support, and the previous question, support from the agency in experiencing a primary versus a secondary traumatic event?
Right, versus secondary, yeah. And although I, too, don't want to influence people's answers, I will tell you that frequently what we end up finding is more feeling not supported after secondary than primary. And when I've asked audiences, okay, you know, and this is consistent. Everywhere I go, we tend to see more people feeling not supported after secondary compared to primary. Some of the answers that I'm given by people is that for many of them, their agencies after a primary trauma, after you've been assaulted or threatened, you got to report that. So management knows. There may be threat protocol. There may be, you know, things that have to be done, and so there may be more opportunity for management to support people after primary. a lot of the secondary trauma, management may not even know. It may not be things that officers are sharing. My guy committed suicide, so I need to do the paperwork, but not necessarily something that needed to go up a chain of command. And so other answers people have given me is that with a lot of the secondary trauma, there's almost a judgment about, well, it didn't happen to you. Why would we think you were affected? You weren't there. So there can often be a way that it is dismissed. Okay, looks like our data is in. So our most common categories, we've got 66% between somewhat, not very much, another 14% not at all. So again, not uncommon. We've got in the almost always and frequently, what is that, 19%? So 19% of people felt supported. And then the rest are falling into the somewhat or not so much. Again, here's the national sample that I've collected so far. We've got 52% of people saying not so much. Again, I think this is really important feedback. And, I think there's a legitimate point that people have made that a lot of times after secondary trauma, people don't even know if you don't say anything, that, you know what, that guy's suicide really came out of nowhere. I'm feeling bad. He had kids. I'm feeling bad, just for them. If people aren't saying it, nobody knows in terms of being able to support them. But at the same time, I do think that there are other times where even when it's said, it's minimized, or it's, you know what, suck it up, that's part of the job. Or there's the fear of the judgment that if you're saying, man, this really bugs me that this happened, then the question is, are you up to this work? Do you have thick enough skin? And most people, certainly, that I have worked with don't want to be viewed like that, so they tend to not say anything. So I think there's a lot of room for us to work with trying to figure out a way to get support, ask for support, as well as provide it after secondary trauma, because what we're seeing clearly is that the data suggests it's happening. The secondary trauma is happening a lot. 60-some% in this sample alone are saying 4 or more incidences throughout their career. So it's occurring. So I think this gives us really good information. Okay, the slide that I have up right now, and don't go away because I do need you to click in, you're going to have some polling coming up on your right in just a second. And these are symptoms of secondary trauma. And so what I'm wanting you to do is when the polling comes up, I want you to click on all that apply in terms of all of these symptoms that you have experienced at some point in the past 2 months. So if within the past 2 months you've struggled with trusting anybody, click, trust. If you've also felt like you've had a loss of innocence in terms of you don't unring the bell, you don't get your innocence back, you don't get to unlearn what human beings are capable of doing. Now, this doesn't have to just have started in the last 2 months. I mean, if you haven't trusted anybody in a good decade, go ahead and count that. Just how many of these would you say you can identify having been present at some point in the past 2 months? And we'll get an idea of how prevalent some of the symptoms are. So we've got the being preoccupied, the hypervigilance, sleeping, chronic exhaustion, feeling numb or detached. Avoidant behaviors can be more than just, drinking. It can also be watching television and just needing to zone out and not be present with anybody else. Could be going to the gym in ways that you just do not want to connect to another human being. This will help again. Yep.
We're gonna redo this poll because it was only allowing one one choice, so we're gonna do this one again.
Okay. All right, everybody. So if you clicked and walked away, back it up. And we're going to try this again where, again, you click all that apply. So we can see how many of these symptoms you have been experiencing. In general, we're finding a good majority are experiencing half of them. the polling disappeared altogether. Is that on my screen? Did it just get reset?
Yeah, it's back up, and you can select all that apply.
Okay. All right. So we'll try this again. You may click all that you have personally experienced at some point. Again, they don't have to have started in the last 2 months, just at some point. Okay, I see somebody saying it's still not allowing. We are having technical difficulties. Okay. Well, here's what I'm going to do. While that's still attempting to work, here's what I'm going to go ahead and show you the answers. Hopefully I'm not influencing it, but for those of you who are not able to put in your data, let me just show you what I found and apologize that we weren't able to get your information. But typically, the most common one that we're seeing is the loss of trust, followed by sleeping disturbances, increased anger, disgust, sadness, distress, loss of concentration or lower concentration. So those top 4 are being reported by more than, or half or more of our population. So again, are you giving them another opportunity here? What are we doing with the polling?
Yeah, I gave that question one more shot.
Okay. I recently did, a couple weeks ago, a training with the VA hospital, and this was the social workers and nurses and direct, case managers that worked with the veterans. And wow, talk about high levels of secondary trauma. They were off the charts.
It's still doing it. I think we're going to have to abandon this question.
Okay. Well, sorry, guys. We were not able to collect your data, but again, here's at least what I found on the national level. And then we may have the same problem with this next one, which will be vicarious trauma. So the third type of trauma we're going to talk about is vicarious trauma. And vicarious trauma, secondary trauma are very similar. There's a lot of overlap. They're oftentimes used interchangeably in the literature. They are different, however. First of all, they're, different authors, but secondary trauma, in my opinion, is at least a little more visceral. It's a little more in your body. You can be on the job 2 days and have a terrible case cross your desk where you're reading the report, you're absolutely, grossed out by the things that you're reading, you can't sleep. I mean, so that can happen very early in a career experiencing secondary traumatic stress. Vicarious trauma is a little more cerebral, where it's a little more about how you look at the world, how you're seeing things. And this is a little more subtle in how it changes, and it tends to take a little bit more time. Usually, you don't even know it's changing until you're saying something to your family and the rest of them are looking at you like you're nuts. And you're, seeing something, get in the car, everybody, get in the car, this is not safe. And they're like, what? I don't see anything, but you see it. And so a great way of somebody explaining it once was that if you think of the worst case you've ever dealt with in your career, there was probably either primary or secondary trauma involved. Vicarious trauma is about the thousands of cases you don't even remember anymore, but they have come as a way of shaping how you are seeing the world. But because we're becoming desensitized as we go along, they're not even, registering as things that we remember much about. So other ideas, one of the best examples of vicarious trauma that I've heard was by Laura Lipsky, and she wrote a wonderful book called Trauma Stewardship. And Laura is a social worker and had done a number of, types of assignments, so she had been exposed to battered women's shelters and homeless shelters and all these different types of trauma exposure. And if you ever get a chance with Laura Lipsky, she is a very funny speaker. She's this little spitfire of a woman off kind of saving the world. And over her career, people had asked her, how do you how do you do what you do? How do you see what you see? And she really was like, you know, it's no big deal. I'm good, you know, just off saving the world. And she said she really didn't think that anything had changed until one year she was out on vacation with her family, and they had gone hiking, and they were told about some beautiful scenic view, and they had spent all morning trying to get to the top of this cliff or something. And she said when they reached the top, they stood out, you know, looking out over this beautiful ocean and scenic view, and her first thought was, you know, wow, that really is beautiful. Her second thought as she looked down over the cliff was, well, I wonder how many people have committed suicide jumping off this cliff. So she turns to her group, her family, and says this out loud, to which she finds out nobody else was actually thinking that. And in fact, one of her relatives kind of was looking back at her in horror and asked, you know, my God, Laura, you know, I really think that all this trauma work is getting to you. And she said it was really at that moment as she's looking at them and they're looking at her, she said she didn't even share the rest of what she was thinking, you know, in terms of, well, I wonder how you get the body out from down there, and where would you land a helicopter, and does this happen so much there's a trauma center on the island or one nearby? And so she's just kind of tactically thinking about this, wasn't upset, wasn't bothered, but as she's looking at them all looking at her, she says that was her cliff of awakening. Because she said it was at that moment that she realized that fundamentally the way she took in the world had changed. And it was a direct result of her exposure to all the suffering that she had seen in the course of her work. Apparently, the most common reaction to a beautiful scenic view is not wondering how many people have committed suicide off it. Who knew? And so this, I think, is a funny and good example in terms of not realizing how fundamentally we change and how we see the world. And so I think, are we going to try polling on this one, Jan, or are we going to not? We'll give this one a try.
Yeah,
this also, okay, this would be another click all that apply. These are the symptoms of vicarious trauma. Again, there's some overlap with secondary trauma. It's that increased cynicism, that chronic suspicion of others. It can certainly affect relationships. I had a juvenile supervisor in probation one time share with me that this was having a pretty dramatic effect on his marriage. He was married to a school teacher, and he said that over dinner they would share their days and, you know, talk about what happened at work and whatnot, and occasionally his wife would share something about, oh, this, you know, poor kid at school, oh, let me tell you the story. And he would usually sit there listening, and then he would reply with something like, oh, you think that was bad? Let me tell you about some of the kids I saw today in the detention facility, right? And then his always trumped hers. And this is part of what Laura Lipsky talks about in her book in terms of that we start to hierarchy trauma. You know, as Laura points out, it's awfully hard to come home after listening to the stuff that we see all day long and hear your kid complain that, you know, somebody was mean to me at school. Yeah, well, they also didn't stab you either. How about that? You know, I mean, 10 minutes we're talking about this, there's not even a weapon. You know, those are the types of responses where, you know, we are losing a little bit of our tolerance or a little bit of a loss of empathy. We're hierarchying trauma. And so it starts to take more and more to get our attention so that we can, you know, it's where you think you've seen it all. Another woman talked about going out to dinner with some friends, none of whom worked in our fields, and somebody, you know, sharing a story about something sad, and everybody else at the table is in tears, and she's just kind of sitting there thinking to herself, well, I don't even think it was that bad. You know, so those are ways of which we sometimes, I think, can feel and realize we're a bit different as a result of our work. Okay, so Jan, do we think this worked? Were you able to collect any data? It says the polling has ended. Can you guys see any numbers on your end? Have I lost my people? Okay, well, I'm going to go on. I'll show you what I have found.
Yeah, this one seems to have worked. Sorry, it's just when it calculates the poll, I can't speak.
Okay, okay. Well, here's what I found so far. So with vicarious trauma, the top answer is this increased cynicism, the chronic suspicion of others, the loss of tolerance, the desensitized, the distorted worldview, the loss of empathy, being reported by more than half of the workforce consistently. And, you know, my big push when we're talking about addressing this topic, I know in community corrections, you know, my department has been involved in evidence-based practices and motivational interviewing techniques and using empathic communication and lots of research showing, you know, that the relationship between the officer and the offender is an important ingredient in the positive offender outcome. I mean, so we get that, we know that, we're teaching it, we're expecting it with our officers. And here's in this slide, I think, one of my I think the most important point, that when you look at this slide, how do you practice empathic communication techniques and use motivational interviewing when more than half of your staff is cynical, not trusting, lost their tolerance, desensitized, you know, distorted worldview, and a loss of empathy? These are directly, in the end, connected to the quality of the services that we provide. And if the course of our work is by just simply surviving the work, having people lose their, you know, compassion, lose their, you know, empathy, become cynical, we've got to figure this thing out. This is not something that I think is just a soft, fun little issue to talk about when we have nothing else and, you know, isn't it nice to do some self-care for staff? This is directly linked to our mission. And that if we don't figure out a way to address this stuff, the quality of the services that we deliver, which the research is showing, the quality of how we deliver it is directly linked to how it's received and ultimately recidivism. These are intimately connected to one another. It is hard to give what you don't have. And so if we are wanting to pass on hope, we need hopeful staff. If we're wanting to have them be empathic, they need to not have lost it already, right? I mean, so I think these are not just something that is a feel-good thing. This is mission-critical thing. Okay, last type of trauma I want to talk about is the sanctuary trauma. And this I actually recently came across. I don't even know who to credit to. I tried to research it, but I've come across it in my work looking at trauma-informed care in the schools, by all places. But how you define sanctuary trauma is it's when you've been impacted, a staff member has experienced some type of trauma, and they are turning to someone or their agency from whom they expect to receive some support, but instead they receive either judgment or indifference. And, you know, this could be minimized. They could be shamed for, you know, you need to suck it up and get some thicker skin. They might be blamed for, well, the guy never threatened anybody else. Why, you know, is he threatening you? I think this is directly linked to the two questions I asked earlier in terms of did you feel supported by your management after your traumatic events? Because the thing is, after trauma, people are raw, you know, and what we're finding in the research is that when it comes to sanctuary trauma, oops, I just blew right through my last point. If we don't meet people with some level of support after they have been through a traumatic event, that lack of how we connect with them can actually be more traumatizing. When they have been through an event and they believe that their department is going to have their back and support them, and they turn to the department for sanctuary, and instead are either not supported, somehow it's minimized, or, you know, the needs or politics of the offender come above taking care of the staff member. This can have a way of being more traumatizing to the employee than the original trauma itself. And I cannot tell you how many times I have talked to people in the hallways of trainings who have shared with me, and I'm watching their eyes and I'm seeing the pain still there, that in their times of need, they did not find sanctuary. And in fact, they were on their own. And this has been, I think, something that has been very, very compelling to hear and see and all the more reason we got to address it. So let me move on quickly because I know that we've got quite a bit more and I want to get to your questions. So what do we do about all this? Well, the starting point, I think, is that the expectations that we can be immersed in suffering and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. I loved this quote. I mean, you do this work long enough, you're going to get wet, right? Laura Lipsky talks about how removing the judgments and the inhuman expectations, those are the precursors to healing. And so when we address this topic, when we even start talking about trauma exposure, I also think that it is absolutely imperative that we understand that the reactions people have to trauma are normal. That is not a sign that they are broken. It is not a sign that they are not coping. It's actually a sign that they are adaptive and they are resilient, that they are protecting themselves. I mean, I'm not saying that becoming cynical is a wonderful thing, but when you're immersed every day in terrible stuff, in suffering, in yuck, figuring out a way to not be impacted by that is adaptive. That's how we protect ourselves. And so I think it is terribly unfair to look at symptoms of trauma and pathologize it as if something is wrong with the person, when in fact I think being impacted is what makes them human. What makes them human is what makes them good at what they do. And that by being human, we are incredibly resilient. We are incredibly adaptive. And so figuring out ways to address this stuff without pathologizing it, I think, is absolutely critical. When we start becoming aware, we start having choices. I can't tell you many trainings I have done where people have come up and said, you put words to how I've been feeling for years. I never knew what that was. And so when we become aware of it, then we also have some choices on how we want to live it out. But when we don't even know what's happening, that makes it quite difficult. Creating work cultures that are promoting healthy coping instead of treating it as if, somebody's broken because they're, impacted by a case. Understand that they're coping with it, and talking about and practicing good self-care. That when we take care of ourselves, that is the highest quality of professionalism. We need to be in good shape if we're going to offer anything to anybody else. Training. When we can talk about this stuff, when we do this, especially my department has been doing this with our new hires now for 4 or 5 years, where all our new hires get this training. And in fact, in the last year, we've been doing this in the evenings where they bring in their family as well. So that it's a little tricky because it's hard to talk about this with people who haven't quite done the job yet. You don't want to scare them to death. But you also want to ethically prepare them for here is, what is some of the impacts of trauma exposure. It allows them to be prepared. It allows them to develop a type of body armor. Psychological inoculation is what they call it. If anything else, it normalizes the stress so that even if they choose never to tell anybody that, man, that case really got to me and I was having problems sleeping at night or, whatever, at least they know that they are not, alone, that this was a very normal reaction by many people. And that's what I think the power of being able to do the polling questions and seeing a vast majority of people saying, yeah, I have been impacted by this stuff so much that it has caused me secondary trauma. It's caused me primary trauma. And that is normal. You are among the masses if that's the case. There is nothing wrong with you. The other thing is that the earlier we can see this, the earlier we can do something about it if we don't like the ways in which we're changing. We can also, in training and education, talk about coping strategies, which I have now not left myself a whole lot of time to talk about. Peer support programs. These are great programs where you have volunteers of people in your agency who have done the job, who get it, and it offers just a safe place for employees to offload and not be judged about how they're, reacting to the work. Peer support has been invaluable in being just a precursor. A lot of people don't need full-blown therapy to get through this stuff. Sometimes they just need to know, dude, it's okay. I felt the same way when I dealt with a case like that. It gets better, it gets easier, and what can I do for you in the meantime? With peer support programs, I think they need to meet the needs of the employees. And so if you're an agency where there's a lot more secondary trauma, then your peer support team needs to focus on secondary and vicarious trauma and not only respond to primary traumatic events. I mean, the shootings and those types of things, if you're waiting for those and they don't happen very often, then your team's not utilized. So it needs to meet the needs. You got to address the stigma around peer support. And that somehow just wanting to talk and get support somehow is not a sign of weakness, being able to just destigmatize that in fact we get back to work a whole lot faster and a whole lot better with a better quality when we have an opportunity to just offload some of it. I'm a big believer that the offer of peer support should be procedure, not forcing people to do it, but offering that it is there for people so that they don't have to go asking. They're already told, hey, look, you know, when people go through stuff like that, we know that some people can have reactions, others don't. We don't know, but we're going to make sure somebody reaches out and offers you, you know, an opportunity to talk if you want it. You don't need it, that's fine, that's up to you. But that's procedure. I think those have been really, really useful. The military has been looking at resilient programs for quite a long time. After a decade of war, we can either deal with trauma after the fact, or we can try to figure out ways to have people more resilient ahead of time so that when the stuff happens, we're able to bounce back. Resilient factors that the research has connected with people being able to bounce back are things like optimism, problem solving, personal awareness, empathy. And again, I'm realizing we're not having a lot of time and I want to be able to get to questions. So this would have been a polling question, but our polling hasn't worked out so well. So I'll just show you what I'm finding in the research, which has been, the good news is we seem to be a pretty resilient bunch of people. The top 6 factors of resilience are being reported by more than half, including problem solving, self-awareness, optimism, a sense of meaning, empathy. Isn't that interesting? Strong social support. All of these are things that are associated with remaining resilient during those tough times. Very last thing I want to point out, and then we'll get to the questions and answers, is a wonderful book by Kelly McGonigal called The Upside of Stress that came out last year. And although this is another webinar in and of itself, one of the things I loved about her work is she redefined stress. And she says that stress is what arises when something we care about is at stake. And in this definition, stress and meaning are inextricably linked, because the reality is we don't stress out about things we don't care about. And we really can't create a meaningful life without experiencing some degree of stress. I mean, this idea that somehow a stress-free life is a happy life is actually a fallacy. A good percentage of people, when they retire, become very depressed, failing to have realized that even though it's in the, you know, grind of the everyday stress of their job, oftentimes there's tremendous meaning in the work that people do. And so I think that's a different way to look at our stress. You know, in no way minimizing. I think inherent in the work that we do is a tremendous amount of stress. The stakes are high. These are people's lives that we're dealing with. And so it makes sense that this would be stressful to a lot of people. But even in this meeting, I had a colleague one time tell me after we were talking about this topic, she went out and she was dealing with somebody in the community who was really quite grumpy about something. And instead of staying and addressing the stress, what she said to that person, as she was clearly very agitated, she said to this woman, "It sounds to me like this really matters to you." And she said instantly, the woman was like, "You know what, it does." And then all of a sudden what she started to do was talk about what mattered about it. And so if you're going into your supervisor's office and you're finding yourself really stressed, or you're a supervisor with employees come into your office being stressed, the reality is they care about what they do. And that, I think, is a great starting point to recognize that the work has meaning. And so on the final note that I want to leave you before we go to the questions is that I think what we can do, and we can do right now, is we can honor the work that we do. We come at it from very different perspectives with 900 people listening to this webinar. in various roles of institutions and community corrections and community resources and whatnot. But the reality is what all of us have in common is that we are spending our careers serving our communities. And as hard and as stressful as that can be, at the same time, it means something. You will never know the number of lives you have impacted through your work. It is impossible to figure out. But I want you to know this. You make our world a better place by doing it. What you do matters. So on that note, Heather, should we kick into some Q&A for the last 6 minutes of our presentation? Do we have
Yes,
Heather?
ma'am, I think we should.
Okay.
All right, so some folks have been sending in questions as we go along. I want to remind everyone that if you'd like to ask a question, simply go to the Q&A box in the top right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see a dialog box open, and you can type your questions in there. Very quickly, before we dive into those questions, Kirsten, if you don't mind advancing the slides, just one more slide. So, folks, these are references that to cover what's been presented here today. I know this is just sort of a quick snapshot, but this presentation, as we said, will be posted online. And so if you're interested, you'll be able to go back and spend some more time combing through the references at that point. Also, you should see up on your screens now contact information, first and foremost, for Kirsten, as the subject matter expert on this webinar, and also for myself and Nathan in case you have any questions for our respective organizations. And with that, I will lead us into the Q&A portion. So, we have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. I will pose these, and Kirsten and Nathan, just please take them.
Okay.
Some, as I said, are comments. Others are just quick questions to review some material that was covered early on. The first question we have is if you could recount the definition of primary trauma.
Yeah, sure. Primary trauma is when you're there. You're directly there. It's either happening to you or you're witnessing it, but your involvement is direct in real time, where secondary is indirect. You're hearing it through somebody else. You're reading a report about it. You're listening to a story after the fact.
Thank you. That's great. Second question. When you were talking about secondary trauma and vicarious trauma, someone asked whether those are the same thing, and if not, if you could just point to the differences between them.
Secondary and vicarious?
Yes, please.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap. Both of them are acquired through other people's experience. So the other people have had the traumatic event, you're reading about it, you're listening. Where they differ, first of all, are the authors who talked about the topics, but secondary trauma tends to be a little more visceral. It's more body, it's hard to sleep at night, you know, you're hypervigilant, where vicarious trauma is a little more about how you're seeing the world differently over time. And so secondary trauma can occur very quickly where, you know, you're on the job 2 days and now you can't sleep anymore. Vicarious trauma, after 5 or 10 years, everybody's a criminal. And it's how you're seeing the world.
Thank you very much. Our next question is seeking some guidance. So a participant asked, what approach would you use with corrections employees who are involved or exposed to multiple incidents every day? Sometimes they don't have time to use coping strategies because there's no time to breathe between incidents, and they cannot always go home between incidents. In fact, sometimes they either choose to stay or are told they must stay. So what approach would you recommend for them to handle those incidents?
Well, you know, and it's a realistic point, especially in custody issues. You can't always just leave. So there is nowhere to go. You got a shift to do. You got an organization to run. And so there are times that just in the moment, you're breathing and you're getting through it. You know, in the moment, I think a lot of times we're responding, we're doing what we need to do. Really what I'm talking about is giving yourself the moment to breathe when you have that opportunity, and it may not be for 8 hours, and if that's the case, that sucks, and I'm sorry. And so you do the best you can to just kind of keep breathing through it, but then afterwards, when you do get a moment, to be able to just treat yourself in a gentle way that allows you to have whatever reactions it is that you have. But while you're still in the midst of it, doing the best that you can to be compassionate and gentle with yourself while you're just trying to get through it. I don't know if that's a great answer or not, but that's what I got.
I think that covers certainly something that could be the topic of an entire other webinar.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I think we've just got a minute left here, so I will throw out one last question and then we'll have to wrap up. Someone else has said, you know, first and foremost, thank you for your work and your research. This person has been an agent for 17 years and wonders, what does the research show are the top 3 things that staff can do on an individual basis to help with the trauma folks deal with day in and day out?
What are the top 3 what?
What are the top 3 things folks can do, or so based on the research, what would be your advice about how folks can deal with each other on an individual basis or deal with staff to help them?
First of all, validate it. Validate it and acknowledge that it has happened and that having a reaction to it is a totally normal experience and it doesn't say anything bad about them. Validation goes a long way. There are times you can't do anything to fix this thing. It is what it is. And so there's times that you just simply say, dude, I'm sorry that, I mean, this must really suck. And just being able to acknowledge that. I think that type of validation is first and foremost so much. I mean, so often I hear people saying who coming out of training that it was the validation, being able to see those numbers and be able to see that their reactions were normal, that there was nothing wrong with them. So validating it first and foremost. Secondly, normalizing that if they are having reactions, that does not mean that there is something wrong with them. It doesn't mean that they can't handle it. It simply means that they're human and that we all respond in different ways, and being then just supportive and giving them some room to be able to manage that in whatever ways of which people do. Some need to stay and be with their colleagues because that's actually where they have the most support. Others may need a little bit of time. Everybody's different and all agencies are different in terms of what it is that they can offer. But being open to acknowledging that our staff are first and foremost our greatest resource and we have to be able to figure out a way to keep them healthy, I think is certainly the start.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kirsten, for your time today and for your expertise. I think judging by some of the comments that folks shared, not only did the sheer numbers show the great interest in this topic, but also that maybe there's a follow-up conversation about responses and some of the things that last question got at.
Yep.
So again, thank you for your time, thank you for your expertise, and thank you very much to Nathan and APPA for partnering with us on this event. And lastly, thank you to everyone who has logged into the webinar today. We know this is an important topic. It's not a question that's going anywhere, and it's certainly a conversation that we all need to pay attention to. So thank you all for your time. You should receive an email sometime the next week or so notifying you that the webinar is available online. In the meantime, if you have any questions for anyone on the webinar today, please just double-check the contact information on your screen, and you can contact folks directly, or you can always contact us here at the National Reentry Resource Center. And have a great day, everyone. Thank you.